Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Hey, Bob. I'm ready, buddy.
Go right ahead, Bill.
Okay, Bob. Thank you. I couldn't hear over the music. But anyway, this is Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this beautiful Wednesday in the middle of August. It is the 16th of August in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to be with you live once again this week. I apologize for not being live yesterday, but as I mentioned, we had a problem where we had nobody in the studio to produce the program, so we had to cancel yesterday because Bob and Agnes both had appointments they couldn't change. So, but we're here today, and it sure is a beautiful day, and I want to welcome everybody to the Virtual Center. I do hope that you find the next couple of hours beneficial for you, meaningful enough that I'm asking you to give up your valuable time. And I'm suggesting that it might be worthwhile, that there might be things in this 2-hour period that you would find very helpful and worth the expenditure of your time. And I'll do the very best I can to fulfill that commitment, or that promise, really, is what I'm doing. I'm going out on the limb here and believing that indeed this might be true. We would love to hear from you. We have a phone number, and if you call that number, we'll get you right on the air, and that'll give you an opportunity to share with our other listeners your thoughts, your ideas, your concerns, your hopes, fears, whatever they might be. We would love to hear from them, and we would love to hear from you. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you're a little bit reluctant to go on the air, but at the same time you'd like to get your ideas or your thoughts on the air, then if you sit down and send me an email, I'll be glad to substitute for you and do the very best I can. You sit down and put in an email what you want to say, and I'll be glad to get it on the air for you. Also, that's not the only thing that you can do with an email. You can send me a message. You can take issue with some of the things I've talked about. You can even reinforce a few of the things I've talked about if you'd like. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN, 906 @gmail.com. That's WAObrien, OBRIEN, 906 @gmail.com. I had thought that I would have something on our Facebook page after our program on Monday, and one thing yesterday led to the other, and I didn't get it on. But I do plan to put one or two things on the Facebook page, if not after our program today, then definitely before we get together again next weekend. I want to resume use of our Facebook page. But let me share with you something that I talked about on Monday, and I want to reiterate it again so it'll be very clear what you're seeing on the Facebook page. This morning I began a class, an American history class, at West Virginia University Institute of Technology, West Virginia Tech it's called. They've moved their whole kit and caboodle here to Beckley from Montgomery, West Virginia, where they finished up this past spring. And those of you who are regular listeners of our program will recall that I taught for West Virginia Tech at the end of the spring semester. I substituted for somebody else because of illness. Well, they have asked me to teach another class, and I agreed to do it. It's a class that meets first thing in the morning. It's an 8 a.m. class on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And it began this morning. And what I've got to tell you, I don't have any real substance about the class. I spent most of the time going over the syllabus. But I had 80 students in the class. It's one of the larger classes I've ever. It's not the largest, actually. My first year of teaching out of graduate school was a lecture hall, and the teaching load when the college in fact, it was at Concord University here in West Virginia. It's what brought me to West Virginia in the first place in the early 1970s. But we received credit for teaching 2 classes because of the size of this thing. We had I think I had about 115 or 120 students in my Western Civilization class. At that time, we taught Western Civilization, but political correctness being what it is, now that's been replaced by world history rather than Western history. And of course, a lot of folks, mainly conservatives, are really uptight about that. They think it demeans the benefit and the value of Western civilization by mixing in all these other inferior civilizations to it, with it. It's a volatile issue among historians. I can assure you. But anyway, the class was large, but we did receive credit for 2 classes for doing a class that large. Well, I'm not getting the equivalent. I'm not being paid for 2 classes. I'm just being paid for 1. And I'm really not looking forward to grading the exams, because I do give written exams, as many of you know, for this many people. But I'll do it because the alternative is not something that ethically I can do, which is resort to short answer and multiple choice and go to the publisher and get the pre-canned true or false tests and all the rest of them that they have. I will not do that. I think I have to keep in mind that students are paying a substantial amount of money in tuition for this class, and I have an obligation to give them the best I can. And cutting corners on the way I teach and the way I test is not something that I'm very comfortable with. Of course, I realize you could argue that the university is cutting corners by putting that many people in the class. So I grant you, but that sounds a little bit more like what's happening on the national scene politically than I'm comfortable with. So I just kind of refuse to think that way. But anyway, what I wanted to mention, and I did mention it on Monday as well, is that I'm going to be using our Facebook page, the Virtual Center Facebook page, in order to post documents for the students in this class. In fact, I'm going to post the syllabus for the course itself on the Facebook page when I get a chance. It's quite extensive. It's long. But I want to have it on the Facebook page for a student in case they missed it or lose their. I gave them a hard copy this morning. But giving 80 people a 6-page document, I would suggest, really is environmentally not a good idea. So if more than anything else, that confirmed the fact that I really do need to use the Facebook page because it saves paper, if nothing else. And I just can't justify delivering hard copies of every document that I would like to cover to 80 people. That seems to me to be environmentally a very, very negative thing. So I want to use the Facebook page for it, but I will, and I told the class about it this morning. So for the first few classes, I'm going to make sure that they understand this as well. I will flag the material that's intended for these students by identifying it as material for the History 152 class at West Virginia Tech. And so if you see that designation, you'll know that particular document is aimed more at the students than just a regular Facebook posting. On the other hand, that doesn't by any means deny you the opportunity to look at the documents. I think most of the documents, well, all of them hopefully will be very legitimate documents for a history class, but it's entirely possible that there are documents in there that you also might benefit from and hadn't seen before or whatever. Although I will say that many of the documents I intend to use are things that we've covered here one way or the other over the years at the Virtual Center. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. On the other hand, I've been writing something. I mentioned it on Monday because I thought I would get into it a little bit, and we didn't quite make it. Once again, Donald Trump and his activities over the weekend, or actions over the weekend, as it were, was sufficient to take up our entire 2 hours on Monday afternoon. And indeed, I do believe that we can begin today's program and as an extension of what we were doing on Monday, because we really didn't, and I don't know that we could do justice to this particular topic, but we can try. Everybody's writing about it. I looked at the Washington Post this morning, and every op-ed piece in there is related to President Trump's speech, press conference from Trump Tower yesterday, on the events over the weekend in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the issue of neo-Nazis and white supremacy. And we talked quite a bit about that on Monday, and I do want to return to it today. But then hopefully at the conclusion of that, which I don't think will take more than what we can cover reasonably within our first hour, then I'd like to get into something that I'm writing myself, and I've been working on it. As you know, we didn't have a program last week, a live program. So I spent the week putting together some thoughts and ideas. I think I'm going to, and I mentioned that I was going to try this before, and I made a couple of stabs some months ago, and then I basically backed off and gave up, but I'm doing it again. I'm going to try to get my ideas down and put together what I'm hoping will be a book. And what I really want to do is include a number of articles that I've been privileged to get published in recent years about the founding. And I'm basically writing what I envision right now as an introduction. But what I want to do is cover some of the main issues about the founders, many of them that we've touched on here. And that's what I'm in the midst of doing. But I think it's going to be a fairly long introductory chapter, and I'm not really sure what that means. But I'd like to share some of it with you, because the irony is, and that's what makes this, to me, so exciting, is that in the process of putting down my ideas and going back and doing some checking and revisiting many of these sources that are available on the internet, almost all of them are available on the internet, we tend to learn a few things. And I've come across two things, and I put together, I think over the last 4 or 5 days, I've probably written 10 pages of material. And of course, some of it is obviously extensive quotations from the founders. But I'm trying to make it read smooth and move from topic to topic, subject to subject, in ways that seem to make it all tie together and make some sense, be interesting and informative at the same time. So it's not the easiest thing to write in the world, but at the same time, I'm so into it and I enjoy it so much. But when I learn something that I didn't really know before, it's really exciting. Because, I mean, if you think about it, who am I to sit down and write a book, and while I'm writing it, I'm learning stuff? But I do. Maybe that's a signal that I'm really not ready to write a book. But on the other hand, if I'm not ready now, then I'll never be ready, because I honestly don't have that much time. So whatever I can do, I need to do. So anyway, I'd like to share a few of these things with you later in our program today. But I guess at the beginning, I'd like to go back to the continuing saga of Donald Trump and his efforts to waffle on the condemnation of neo-Nazis and white supremacists that he uttered on Monday under pressure, under media pressure, pressure from his own party, pressure from many people on his staff. And the result was that he said the right words on Monday, but as many people have commented, and I'm sure you've noticed as well, it was absolutely devoid of passion. There was very little, if any, passion at all in what the president was saying in condemning the violence in Charlottesville, which happened on Saturday after the Friday night torch march on the University of the University of Virginia campus the night before. Friday night. One of the more interesting things from that, of course, is they were carrying these torch lights, these torches that we sometimes light in the evening around our backyard to keep the mosquitoes out. And they were carrying these in the torchlight parade and demonstration they had at the University of Virginia on Friday night. And the company that makes these things made it a point to disavow the company from what this group of so-called alt-righters, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, whatever you want to call them. I guess they're all a little bit of all in there. But the manufacturer of the torches made it a point to disavow the company from the ideas of these people that were giving so much free advertising to the product that this company made. And that's a little aside that I'm sure many of you probably heard in other places. It's not original with me by any stretch. But the fact of the matter is the president, under pressure on Monday, basically said the right things. It took him 2 days to do it, or as a couple of people, many people have promised, after on the third try, he finally made it. But then yesterday he backtracked. He waffled. He basically went back to his original comments on Saturday about the fact that the violence was horrible, but both sides were responsible for it. It wasn't just the fault of one particular side, the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis. And of course, in response to that, you may have heard or seen where David Duke thanked the president for stepping back and laying blame on both sides and not just trying to pin it all on one side. And yesterday at an impromptu press conference in the lobby of Trump Tower, the president got into it with some of the media over the particular statement that he made on Saturday that there was violence on both sides, hatred and violence on both sides, and raised all sorts of questions, which put the president yesterday into a position where he felt the need to defend himself and to defend his statement that it really wasn't just one side. It really wasn't just the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists who were responsible for this particular violence. And of course, the fact of the matter is they showed up in battle helmets with shields and weapons and sticks and steel rods, and quite a bit of video showing them, a group of them beating a counter protester, an African American counter protester, in the exit, or the exit to a parking garage very, very near the statue of Robert E. Lee that the whole thing theoretically was about, taking that statue down. And the president then proceeded to defend his middle-of-the-road position. So in a sense, what the president effectively did was take back the statement that he delivered on Monday, which really wasn't very hard to him because there was none of him in it anyway. There was no passion, there was no sincerity, there was no emotion involved. He was merely reading words that somebody else had written, and he obviously wasn't committed to them. And the fact that he stepped back so easily yesterday is an indication as to where his priorities really are, where he stands on this thing. And it seems to me that there's absolutely no question as to where he stands. He clearly is acknowledging the reality, it seems to me, that a significant portion of his base, a significant portion of his support, comes from people who belong to these groups. This particular mentality of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, white superiority are clearly positions that the president is comfortable with. If he wasn't, he wouldn't be so careful about not taking issue with them. One of the more interesting elements associated with the story, of course, is his daughter Ivanka and her husband Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner, as we know, is Jewish. Not only that, but in marrying Ivanka, she also converted to Judaism. The president has pointed that out more than once to deny allegations that he's in any way anti-Semitic. And we'll remember it wasn't that long ago during the Holocaust, the anniversary of the Holocaust, that the president spoke out but didn't include the mention of Jews in talking about the Holocaust. Rather, he took the very same position he's taking now, namely, that in the name of religion and in the name of race and nationality through the years, throughout history, there has been horrendous violence. And all of it he decries. He opposes. Not once on this particular anniversary of the Holocaust did the president even mention the Jews. In response to that, more than one commentator, pundit, whatever, raised the issue of anti-Semitism on the part of the president. And he immediately pointed to his son-in-law and his daughter as evidence that he was the least anti-Semitic of any political person, anybody in politics that they would know. And now, in the last 24 hours, he's basically done the same thing. It's very interesting because some of the white supremacists that were involved in the Charlottesville thing have made it a point to make reference to his son-in-law and his daughter, Ivanka. So the people that he ought to be criticizing are pointing out their own anti-Semitism in comments they're making about his son-in-law and his daughter. But the fact of the matter is, he either didn't see it or chooses not to comment upon it, because it would be politically sensitive, obviously, to him. The other point that is kind of interesting, and I don't know this to be true, my wife pointed this out to me, and that is that she saw this particular reference to Jared Kushner and Ivanka on CNN, and the president has made it a point to emphasize that he doesn't watch CNN because it is what he called fake news. He did that again over the weekend in a confrontation with CNN's Jim Acosta. Many of you might have seen the cartoon posting of the Trump train that was sent to him, and he immediately jumped on it and shared it on his Twitter site, and then took it down, pulled it back, but not quickly enough. The thing went viral. And what it shows is a train with Trump's name on the side, the Trump train, as it were, running down a CNN reporter. And a number of people recognize, of course, that this is totally inappropriate. Not only is it inappropriate in its own right, anytime that something like that is put on the internet or on Twitter or anywhere else, but especially after the death of the young lady in Charlottesville that was run down by the Dodge Charger. I guess it was a Challenger, I'm not really sure. Driven by Fields, the Ohio white supremacist neo-Nazi. To put this on on Twitter Now, this particular cartoon was totally insensitive, distasteful. And apparently somebody must have pointed that out to the president because he immediately pulled it. But he didn't pull it fast enough. A lot of people got ahead of it and shared it, and it went viral. This is frightening because it's very obvious that the President of the United States is making political decisions in the face of a tragedy, in the face of the latest episode in an ongoing tragedy, a situation that many of us believed had been resolved. But in the 8 months since the election of Donald Trump, it's become very clear that there's a lot more support for the white superiority, the white supremacist, neo-Nazi positions in this country and in Europe also than any of us ever dreamed there would be. It's been repressed because our society has made a decision long ago that this was distasteful, it was un-American, it was immoral, it was inhuman, it was insensitive, and it was wrong. The result has been not that it's gone away. The result has been that a number of people whose sentiments go in that direction have been repressing it. And over the last 8 months, they have reached a conclusion that it's no longer necessary for them to suppress it anymore, and it's coming out. President Trump's election has sent a signal to these people that it's okay to support and be for what they've always been told was too distasteful to even own up to. Positions that up in the past they would deny having and would accuse those who would accuse them of having these positions for doing it. Now they are becoming very open and very proud to say and do what they long been prevented from saying and doing. I think the issue is, as a society, as a civilization, most people have reached the conclusion that this is wrong, distasteful. The president's comments yesterday that many of the people marching in Charlottesville were there in support of not taking down the statue of Robert E. Lee. They were primarily history buffs who were defending history, even though they were doing it on a march organized and led by white supremacists and neo-Nazis. The president said all the people marching weren't white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Some of them were, and this is the president's own words, fine people. Let me say, and only one way that I can say it, fine people were not marching on Saturday in Charlottesville on that side of the fence. Fine people are not neo-Nazis. They aren't white supremacists. They don't march with them. They don't want to be associated with them. They don't, by implication, even want to be lumped together with them in conversation. Because our society has made a decision that fine people don't think this way, don't act this way, don't believe this way, and in fact have a responsibility to stand up against it. Which raises the question, about whether in fact the President of the United States is one of the, quote, fine people, unquote. He thinks he is. But the fact of the matter is, mainstream society has decided that he's not. There's one other aspect of this. This is part of this we touched upon Monday. I don't want to go back through the whole thing again from Monday. But we talked about the conflict, the difficulty, as it were, in the history of this nation, in wrestling with the differences, or the difficulty, I guess you could say, of supporting the positives of pluralism on the one hand, and avoiding the overemphasis on pluralism to the point that you end up involved in what many people in their writings have referred to as identity politics. A number of people have looked at the results of the November election and have come to the conclusion that the Democratic Party inadvertently slid into the trap of identity politics during the election. They so directed the campaign toward groups, gays and lesbians, women, African Americans, Muslims, Hispanics. In other words, they were politically aiming their emphasis and their campaign at what made these groups different from everybody else, rather than emphasizing what made them like everybody else, what they had in common. The fact of the matter is, what President Trump was successful in doing was emphasizing the commonality of a particular group of people, those people that felt that they were being left out of the equation, that the government had become so focused on doing for different ethnic, religious, and racial groups that it was ignoring white, male, working class people like them. And President Trump's and his researchers, his Democratic numbers crunchers, if you will, were able to pick up on this and direct a campaign aimed specifically at these people by appealing to them as a discriminated against minority. These people were being ignored. They were being silenced. They were no longer being listened to. They were being taken for granted. And in effect, what President Trump's campaign was able to do was convince these people that they too were a disaffected group. They were no longer the mainstream of the American electorate. They were an ignored, taken for granted, ignored group. In other words, they felt that they had become victimized. And President Trump's campaign was able to play to that. What it speaks to, it seems to me, is the real difficulty of honoring pluralism on the one hand, but not allowing yourself to become so enmeshed and focused on pluralism that you go overboard and ignore the unum in a pluribus unum, from many one. This came back to me this morning when I read Tom Friedman's latest column in the New York Times. Tom Friedman is in Arabia, is in the Middle East right now, and he was talking about the degree of pluralism in America's military efforts throughout the world. And he was talking about officers in the Air Force and generals And he was talking about the ethnic, racial, and religious differences that are so visible in our armed forces, in our effort to fight ISIS and Iran and Al-Qaeda and all the rest of it throughout the world. And his point is that there are so many different groups represented in America's effort that we are winning because we are pluralistic, because we honor the benefits and the beauty of pluralism. And it raised this issue once again, namely the question as to whether the Democrats lost the election because of their commitment, political commitment to pluralism. It's a very, very fine line to walk. It's very difficult. I don't know that Democrats will make the same mistake again. I trust that they won't. But the fact of the matter is, it's a major issue, and the fact that it keeps coming up over and over again in so many different contexts speaks to its significance and its importance, and how difficult it is to manage, to balance the idea of diversity on the one hand and unity on the other. In order to win elections, you got to focus on the unities, not the divisions. But there's absolutely no question that throughout history, people have been coming to this country because in this country, people who are different are given a chance. But it's very obvious that our track record is not perfect by any means. And what we are going through right now is an example of just how imperfect that track record is. And that takes us back, it seems to me, to the current situation with President Trump. But more particularly, to the present situation with President Trump as a Republican. One of the things that has encouraged many people in the last few days is the awareness that a number of prominent Republicans have taken issue with the president's stance on this particular Charlottesville situation. Orrin Hatch, Senator Gardner, and several others, John McCain, and several others, have taken issue with the president and pointed out that neo-Nazism, white supremacy, is wrong. It's evil. And under no conditions ought it to ever be condoned. And so they are chastising the president. But it's important to mention that it doesn't really cost anything to chastise. A lot of times it's done for political reasons as much as anything else. These guys, these people are politicians. They need to run for re-election. They have to be very careful, especially when they have a president who seems to get them into so many potential or prospective jams, political jams, in which they have to be very careful. They have to not be seen as an ally of the president on this particular issue, but at the same time, they must remain allies of the allies of the president for political reasons. And the one thing that hasn't happened yet is that the Orrin Hatches and all the rest of them are still voting in support of the president's agenda items. The Republican leadership, once again, has decided, apparently, to not take issue with the president, Paul Ryan made a very open statement, clear statement about the evils of white supremacy and neo-Nazism. Paul Ryan comes from southern Wisconsin, from Jamesville, Wisconsin. Wisconsin is an interesting state. I went to school there and I became kind of interested in it. It has a very, very strong progressive tradition. At the beginning of the so-called progressive period in the 20th century, when the progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt and the progressivism of Woodrow Wilson were jousting for political power, among state governments, Wisconsin was considered number one in terms of its commitment to progressivism. It's kind of bothered me that the state that led the nation in progressivism for so long has now reverted to one that would elect Paul Ryan, and more specifically Donald Trump, for President of the United States last November. But it's also very clear in Paul Ryan's statement that he has one eye clearly on his political constituents as he makes up his mind on what to say about this, as he has on so many other issues. But the fact of the matter is, until the Republican leadership is willing to politically do something, which would be to separate itself from the loose canonism that they find themselves wrestling with in the White House. Many people have seen issue after issue after issue, which in their mind they believe justifies the fact that something politically ought to be done and has to be done to rein in this president and rein in this administration. Whether it's impeachment, who knows what it is. But the fact of the matter is, it is the friendliness of the Republican leadership that has enabled him to continue to get away with these things one after the other. Some people are beginning to see this latest situation over Charlottesville as in many ways worse than his attacks on Muslims, his attacks on women, his unseemly comments about women in the very famous tape situation coming off the bus, you'll remember, and a number of other things. But the fact of the matter is, Mitch McConnell is silent. Paul Ryan politically is silent. And it would seem to me that it's only when we see the Republican Party separate itself from President Trump's positions on health care and on a number of other issues, tax cuts and all the rest of it, that we might actually begin to believe that the Republican Party has finally decided to separate itself from the missteps of President Donald Trump. So far, that hasn't happened. So, your conclusion, it would seem to me there's a number of different conclusions. I was chatting with Bob a little bit, and I know Bob's going to go in this direction on his program later this evening. You can't not deal with these kinds of issues, it seems to me. They're that important. But the question has to be raised. In spite of the statements of Orrin Patch and Senator Gardner and Tom Cotton in Arkansas and John McCain and a few others, Marco Rubio is one who spoke out against the president on this. But the fact of the matter is they're still all voting with him. And one has to be aware, and one has to ask the question, how much of the support that the Republican Party receives in the nation comes from people whose sentiments are in the direction of white supremacy. Let's be honest. President Trump obviously sees an awful lot of his political support being in this particular camp. If that's true, if that's where an awful lot of Republicans are emotionally and philosophically, then one has to believe that Republican leaders other than President Trump know that. And that much of their behavior and their political sensitivities speak to it. So maybe the real issue here is the Republican Party. And that the only chance that we've got to really put this issue to rest rests in the hands of Republican leadership. How can it possibly be that so many Americans believe that this is wrong? That those people who feed on racial, gender, nationality, and religious hatred and bigotry, so strong is the sentiment against this in the country. How can there be one of two major political parties that's so careful in the way they dance around this particular issue? I think all of us need to confront that for purposes of understanding. But the reality is Republicans need to confront it for reasons that are a lot more important than that. We have a right as Americans to know where these people stand. They don't want to tell us. In several cases, they're saying the right things, but they're saying them in ways where they're not really putting any chips, any political chips into the pot. They're risking very little. They're not even risking taking on the President of the United States, who clearly never takes his eye off the political realities of what's going on and where his support comes from. Maybe what the whole situation and the Republican leadership's unwillingness to take a really strong stand against it and do something about it speaks to the fact that they too know that a significant, important element within their own party is sympathetic to the goals of neo-Nazism and white superiority and anti-Semitism and all the other negatives associated with it. If that's true, then we better take the nation back, because they got power. And that means that this is a lot more serious and a lot more dangerous than any of us ever thought. It comes down to a lot more than 19 people being injured and one young lady being killed in Charlottesville on a Saturday night in the middle of August in the year 2017. It goes all the way back to Lincoln. It goes all the way back to our commitment to the abolition of slavery. It goes back to the issues associated with affirmative action and many other issues. Basically, what it speaks for is the reality, a very disturbing reality, especially speaking as we are here on this program. Basically, what we're talking about is an unwillingness to many of those people in positions of power in this republic to really buy in to the legacies left us by the founders. This issue would be poison to the founders. It was an issue that even then they knew was an issue that the nation would have to come to grips with at some point in time. They would be mortified if they recognized that here we are in 2017 and we're still engaged in this. I really do believe that this issue is one that's not going away until we make it go away. I've heard many people talk about the fact that in this country we've never reached the point where we can have an honest conversation about race, or we can have an honest conversation about principles or about humanity. And it just absolutely runs up and down all over me when I hear Donald Trump, of all people, talking about the fact that we're all children of the same God and we all bleed the same red. Because that's true. But it's being said by somebody for whom it means nothing. And those people that continue to support him, whether they like it or not, are choosing that side and are choosing to be lumped with that particular issue, of that particular side on these particular issues. They might be fine people, but if they really are fine people, they need to take this on and do it now. I'm struck by my friend Wayne Ribich's statement about Democrats and Republicans in West Virginia and his concern over the years that organized labor in West Virginia was always reluctant to vote against people that were willing to vote for organized labor on certain issues, even though they were Republicans. And I know a number of people who fall into that category who say, I voted for these Republicans because they support our positions on labor and on contracts and unions and minimum wage and all the rest of it. They're Republicans, but they're fine people. And Wayne's response always is, if they're such fine people, let them become Democrats. Because as long as you remain Republican, your marching orders are coming from the people that we've been talking about for the last 45 or 50 minutes. And they aren't fine people. That's about all I can say. I obviously welcome your comments. This is so sensitive and so difficult in many ways for me. I'm very, very skeptical of myself in these kinds of issues. Because I know, I'm not naive, I know enough to know that I can't really appreciate what many people in this nation now and in the past have had to go through that they didn't deserve. And I didn't have to go through that. In that sense, I was privileged. I know that. I'm aware of it, but I can't feel it, if that makes sense. I feel it in the pain of others. But I know there are a lot of people out there who say, until you walk in my shoes, you don't know what it's like. I've been on this face of this earth long enough and have faced and read about and thought about these issues often enough to appreciate the fact that I don't really have a good response to that point, because I can't. I really can't. The only thing I can do is do everything that I can do to kind of help or work to change situations so that the pain for others goes away. It's not a good deed. It's a necessary deed. It's something that all of us need to do, it seems to me, in order to live with ourselves. And in order honestly to stand up and live the life that we all know we should be living. And until we're willing to do that, it seems to me, we're equivocating. We're walking the fine line. We're being careful. We're being politically cautious. I've done it over the years, and I know many of the people listening have done it as well. But the fact of the matter is, we are now seeing what we've sown. The results of the seeds that we've allowed to fester in our society. We didn't put it down. We pretended that it was down. We danced around it. We walked around it. We said all the right things. We voted for all the right people, theoretically. We did everything we could do to convince ourselves that we were doing our best to put these issues away for good. It's very obvious that they weren't being put away for good. That it's going to take a lot more than we've done already to do this. Maybe this is the time. Maybe finally we've turned the last corner and we're heading toward the finish line. It would be ironic if the last waste stop or water station on the road to that finish line was in Charlottesville, Virginia, where Mr. Jefferson's university is. In Virginia itself. I lived there for 15 years. I used to travel frequently up and down Monument Avenue in Richmond. I saw all the old statues of the heroes. Heroes in gray. It's brought tourists into Richmond for years. And I'll be honest with you. Not once did I ever think that I should stand out there and advocate taking those statues down. I looked upon them as being quaint. Yet the fact of the matter is there's a significant African American population in Richmond, in East Richmond and South Richmond. And I never thought to ask what those people thought of those statues on Monument Avenue. But now I'm beginning to realize the realities that I didn't see then. And I'm thankful for this program, for an opportunity to the occasion to put some of these thoughts together for myself. It's the top of our first hour. It's 2 p.m. in the East. I think we'll pause and take our 5-minute break. And when we come back, I promise we will be pending If somebody calls and wants to pursue this topic further, by all means, I encourage you to do that. But if that doesn't happen, then we'll go in a different direction in our second hour. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's Wednesday. It's the 16th day of August in the year 2017. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back, and we'll pursue our second hour together. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome, if you are just joining us, to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Wednesday, the 16th day of August in the year 2017, we are live. After this hour today, we won't be back again until next Monday, where we'll be live again. I mentioned that between then and now, I will have met, next time we get together, I will have met my class on Friday morning and again on Monday morning, twice in the interim before we meet again. And I'm guessing that by that time we'll be into some substantive material, and it's possible that I'll be able to make a comment or two that based on a little bit more than observation of walking into a room at 8 a.m. in the morning and being faced with 80 people staring at me, wondering, what's this old guy doing in this class? You know, this kind of thing. So anyway, welcome to our second hour. If you are just joining us, welcome. If you have been with us through the first hour, then you know that we spent the first hour, for the most part, dealing with the president's Charlottesville response, or lack of response, or equivocation response, or whatever you might want to call it. But and I promise that pending a call from a listener, which would be based on that particular topic, if that didn't happen, that we would be pursuing something totally different. What I'd like to do in the second hour is get back into the 18th century a little bit. You know, in a lot of ways, it's a nicer place, if that makes sense sometimes. But anyway, before we do that, let me share with you our phone number, along with our email address, and I'll remind you about our Facebook page. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to send me an email, I would love to hear from you. And if you'd like, and you're a little bit reluctant to go on the air and share your ideas on the air, I'd be glad to substitute for you if you put what you want to say into an email that I can use. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And I'd like to call your attention once again to our Facebook page. Again, I remind you, if you weren't with us the first hour, that you're going to see some postings on the Facebook page that are headed with the announcement that particular posting is for students in the West Virginia University Tech History 152 class. I'll be using the Facebook page in order to post documents. I do intend, as long as it is, to put our syllabus for that course on our Facebook page. And what I'm hoping is, and I told class this morning, and I'll repeat the same thing on Friday, that I hope that when students see something on our Facebook page that they want to make sure they retain, that they'll copy and paste it into their own Word files, or create it into a Word document. And they'll be able to do that just by scrolling and pasting the Facebook page. So that's what I'm hoping, that they'll be able to do. They could do it with documents or whatever. So I just want to clarify that I'll be using the same Facebook page for the next several months for two somewhat different things. But again, you are not excluded from looking at these documents yourself, because I think they're viable and in many cases important documents. And I'm telling the students in my class the same thing. They are not prohibited from looking at our Facebook page. In fact, I reminded them, but I'll do that again on Friday. They are not prohibited from tuning into our program here in the Virtual Center either. And hopefully a few of them will. I think some of them just want to test it to see whether in fact it really is a program. But I'm guessing that once they do that for most of them, that'll probably be the last time, but maybe I'm wrong. If they happen to tune in at the right time and they find it very interesting, then maybe they'll be with us for a while. But anyway, if you are a regular user of Facebook, you know how easy it is. Just go to the search box at the top of the homepage and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you'll be onto our Facebook page. And again, there'll be postings there for this particular program, as well as postings there for the history class that I'm teaching at West Virginia University Tech. So with that, I'd like to return to those thrilling days of yesteryear, which is the 18th century. And more specifically, I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts as I try to put them down in some of the, I think, more interesting issues related to this period that we've touched upon here. But what I'm finding is that as I write them and put them down, sometimes I run across things that I didn't really appreciate the first time through. Or I saw them in one particular context, but I never saw them in this one. Let me share with you. There are two things that I really want to emphasize in this hour. And I'm going to do it at the front of the hour because I'm really not sure how long it's going to take. And I don't want to let the hour end without getting to those. I don't want to spend the hour touching upon things that we've already touched upon here, because a lot of that is a rehash of things we've done before, and I don't want to do that. I will, because I think in many cases it's worthwhile, and I'll share some of that with you. But what I'd like to do more than anything else in this hour is share with you a couple of issues that I can't wait for the opportunity to sit down in the next couple of days and wrestle with, because I got to change my way of looking at these. I think I was wrong. In one case especially. In the other case, I think I was blind, that I'm guilty of a horrendous omission. And now it suddenly hit me. When I mention it now, it seems so obvious. It's kind of interesting because the issue that I'm talking about relates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And I use that as an example in the first orientation class this morning, the first meeting of my history class. And what I was talking about was the syllabus. And more specifically, I was talking about some of the sensitive issues that this history class was going to get into. And I wanted them to understand and appreciate why I was doing it. And more specifically, I mentioned religion. And I told them that we would, especially in the first semester of this course, in the early period, the colonial period, as well as the period of the founding, we would be doing a lot with the issue of religion. I'm not teaching, and I've made this point, I'm not setting out to teach religion. I'm not setting out to convert anybody to Christianity or anything else. But what I am doing, I told them, is trying to understand the past. And over the years, I've come to the realization that in order to understand the past, we not only have to know what people did, but more importantly, why they did it. And some of the obstacles that they confronted in doing it. Sometimes they violated their principles. Sometimes they wouldn't. And their principles won out. Oftentimes at the expense of something historically that's quite significant. Those are the two examples that I want to touch on. So let me begin. And let me take on the first one. And it relates to our friend, Thomas Jefferson. I reached a place in this particular document where I was addressing the issue of republicanism in America. More specifically, I was focusing on the degree to which James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and the other supporters of the Constitution believed and argued that this new Constitution did not violate the principles of republicanism. Madison, in one of the Federalist Papers, number 39, makes it very clear, and I quoted this, that a republic really defines the genius of the American people. Madison knew, and those who voted with him agreed, that if the Constitution created a government that violated the principles of republicanism, then Madison said in number 39, in Federalist 39, that it should never be ratified. In a sense, what Madison was saying is, if anybody can prove to me that this government is not Republican, that this Constitution is not Republican, I will, small r, by the way, not big R, then Madison is saying, in effect, I will be the first one out there to disavow that Constitution. But what I did, and what I've set out to do, and I think I completed, was make the point that in sticking to the principles of republicanism as Madison understood them, more particularly as Madison wanted the people of this country to understand them, he, in effect, changed the entire meaning of the nature of a republic. Those opposed to the Constitution, the anti-federalists, the Graysons and the Patrick Henrys and the Elbridge Gerrys and the Luther Martins and some of the other leading opponents of the Constitution, explained republicanism and their commitment to it by going back to Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws. And in that book, in his writings, Montesquieu explained that in order for a republic to be successful, it had to be small. And we've touched on this many times, so I won't put a lot of time into it. But Montesquieu argued that the nature of a republican form of government, by definition, a republic means elected representatives. So clearly a republic would have elected representatives representing the will of the people. But the question is people's ability to express their will to the representative. In order for republicanism to work, Montesquieu argued, a republic had to be small enough that the representative would know his constituents well enough to know what they wanted and what they needed. The people, on the other hand, in that particular district, needed to know the representative well enough to be able to contact him and influence him and remind him what the people wanted and what he was expected to do as elected representative. And if they didn't do it, if the representative didn't do it, didn't follow the will of the people, then that representative would be replaced at the next election. Consequently, in a republic, elections were frequent. That's why in the House of Representatives, we have an election every 2 years. The argument is that this is the branch that's closest to the people. Therefore, the people must remain close to it. And the way to do that is to force the representatives to stand for re-election, to hold themselves accountable before the people often. That's what Montesquieu believed a republic had to be in order to be a real republic. What that means is, and this is me talking now, this is my interpretation. What that means is, to Montesquieu, what made a Republican government unique was that in a republic, it was clear to people, to all people, as to who made the decisions. The people did. The constituents did. The voters did. Montesquieu was a supporter of the idea, as were many of these anti-federalists who supported Montesquieu in his writings on republicanism, that the people had the right to instruct their representative, not just consult their representative, not just to bend the ear of the representative, but to instruct him, to tell him what to do and how to vote. And if he didn't do it, he was out next time around. Madison, as we know, in the Constitution of the United States, changed the process totally. In Madison's larger elective districts, the larger congressional districts, Madison and Federalist Number 10 talked about enlarging the sphere. When you enlarge the sphere and make the district bigger, Madison says, you take in more people. You have more particular interest groups, more factions. You have so many different competing points of view on issues that there really isn't a will of the people. There are a variety of wills of the people, all of them vying for the honor of being the one that's selected. And that's what the elected representative did, was pick the particular issue that he supported. In other words, the major difference between Montesquieu's view of a republic and Madison's was that in Montesquieu, the people called the shots. Madison's approach to a republic did everything necessary to make sure that the people could not call the shots. That was what the Constitution was about. That's why Madison believed the Articles of Confederation had to be abandoned. Because the Articles of Confederation, putting power on the local level, on the state level, made it too easy for majority factions to rule by majority will and control the representative. The only way you could render the representative independent of the people's control is to enlarge the district, enlarge the sphere, so that there were so many competing interests that the representative would be the one who decided which one was the right one. So the major difference then between Montesquieu and Madison is a difference in who has the power. those special people who are elected representatives are the bulk of the people themselves who have the ability to tell the representative what to do. Madison makes that impossible with his Constitution and his concept of the enlarged sphere, as he writes about it in Federalist Number 10. The result is the reason a republic is the solution to Madison is because a republic results in a delegation of government from the voters to the representative. What that means is Madison's definition of a republic was different. Than Montesquieu's. And increasingly, Madison's definition of republic focused more on process than it did on substance. Madison, for example, points out in number 39, Federalist number 39, that there are so many different examples in the world of governments that call themselves Republican, that it's impossible to decide a clear definition as to what a republic really is. He goes to England. He goes to Venice in Italy. He looks at France. He looks at Holland. Not France. Holland and Poland. France is a monarchy, clearly, so that didn't count. All of these, Poland, Venice, England, all of them called themselves republics. They were all different. Madison's conclusion, then, is that it's not really possible to describe what a republic needs to look like because they look so different. Rather, Madison says what we have to do is see what they all have in common and use that commonality as our way to define republic. And Madison says in Federalist number 39, if we resort for a criterion to the different principles on which different forms of government are established, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all of its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited time, or during good behavior. In other words, it doesn't matter whether the representatives are elected for a short time, or for a long time, or life. What matters, what defines a republic, Madison says, is that the representatives are elected by all the people, not just a small group of the people, but all the people. It is essential to such a government, Madison says, that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. If you have one small group of people controlling the representatives, then you've got a plutocracy. In order to have a republic, the representative must represent all the people. So what's the difference then between Madison and Montesquieu? The difference is that Madison's focus is on process, not substance. Madison disagrees with Montesquieu on who ought to make the final call. Therefore, Madison can't use that to define the republic, because the Constitution, if you look at it that way, is not a republic. The only way that Madison can make the point that the Constitution needs to be a republic is if he redefines republic from who makes the decisions to the fact that the people elected are elected by the great body of the people. In other words, if there are elections, if the people elected represent the people, then you got a republic, Madison said. That's it, pure and simple. That's the only common feature they all have. Well, that creates a problem. And this is one of the two issues that I wanted to focus on in this hour. Thomas Jefferson, after the Constitution is ratified, after he serves 2 terms as president from 1800 to 1808, in 1816, 8 years after he left the presidency, Madison revisits the issues of republicanism. And this is what he says. I'm going to read it in its entirety. Quote, "A government by its citizens in mass, acting directly and personally according to rules established by the majority, and that every other government is more or less republican, in proportion as it has in its composition more or less of this ingredient of the direct action of citizens. Governments are more or less republican as they have more or less of the element of popular election and control in their composition. And believing as I do that the mass of the citizens is the safest depository of their own rights, and especially that the evils flowing from the duperies of the people are less injurious than those from the egoism of their agents, I am a friend to that composition of government which has in it the most of this ingredient." Can you imagine, and this is what I was writing, can you imagine Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, a wordsmith that John Adams said in 1876 had such a masterful pen that only he could do justice to writing the Declaration of Independence. The man who everybody respected for his brilliance in his ability to write and express themselves, writes a paragraph on republicanism that contains 4 times the phrase more or less in it. It's vague. It's ambiguous. It doesn't say anything. From the man who's respected for his ability to say everything. My reaction to this is that by 1816, Jefferson must have thrown in the towel. By this time, he must be on board with what the Constitution was really about. But the only way he could be was to not point out the obvious change in the nature of republicanism. So the only way he could deal with it is to dance around it and not acknowledge what, in fact, the Federalists had got away with. And then I started to rethink this paragraph. And I thought, hell, maybe not. Maybe if Jefferson hasn't had signed on at all. Maybe this more or less stuff is his tongue-in-cheek way of saying this is wrong and I can't go along with it. The only way I can explain what you guys have done is to obfuscate, is to dance around it, is to evade it, avoid it, not say what I really know to be true. And I resent it. And if you don't believe that that's what I had to do, read this paragraph. Because it's the broadest, most ambiguous paragraph I've ever written in my life. It says nothing and I'm ashamed of it. But it's all I can do without revealing what we've done. I'm going to have to work in the next few days in order to resolve that contradiction in Jefferson. I thought I had it down pat. I thought it made perfect sense to me. But I was jumping to conclusions, I think. And I have to revisit it. That's why writing this stuff is not nearly as easy as sometimes you think it's going to be. That's what makes it a challenge. I love it. I love it. But here's the next one. Here's the second issue that I wanted to share with you. We've got about 22 minutes left, so I think I can do it. It relates to the Constitutional Convention. More specifically, it relates to a delegate from New York other than Alexander Hamilton. When you ask anybody about the delegation or the delegates elected to represent their states in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention, when people mention New York, they mention Hamilton because he was one of the major figures. He was the author of the bulk of the Federalist Papers, which were written and published in New York to get the Constitution ratified. So this was Hamilton's baby, the Federalist Papers, that project. Madison signed on, and he took on the issues of the more abstract. Hamilton was the attorney. Hamilton was the attorney. He wrote some of the straight, more direct stuff. But the real abstractions, the real philosophy and theory, Madison's the one that took those on in the 10 or 12 Federalist Papers that he wrote. But there were two other delegates to the Constitutional Convention from New York. One of them was Robert Yates, and the other one was John Lansing. And what our history books tell us, what we know about the New York delegation, is that Hamilton was in the minority from his own state. Whenever it became time for the state of New York to vote on an issue at the Constitutional Convention, it was 2-1 against Hamilton. The result was that through the first several weeks of the convention, Hamilton said almost nothing. If you look at Madison's notes of the convention, which are the most detailed notes we have, because Madison was there from beginning to end, he didn't miss a day. He basically says who spoke on what and basically what they said. He doesn't mention Hamilton until the convention gets from May into June. And then in early June, on one day, Hamilton speaks for 6 hours. We've talked about that. because what Hamilton said in those 6 hours is in another set of notes on the convention taken by his fellow New Yorker, Robert Yates. Yates was an anti-federalist. Hamilton was a federalist. Turns out we covered that speech from Hamilton. Where we know about what he said, what Hamilton said, is from Yates. Yates was Hamilton's political opponent. He hated Hamilton. Therefore, there's no question. He crafted his notes. He detailed every bad thing that Hamilton said about republicanism, about the abilities of the people to govern themselves, about why England's Constitution was the one we ought to model ourselves on, and why we needed a monarchy, because nothing short of a monarchy would keep the masses of the people in line and in order. We know, for example, that in one part of that speech, and I'm going to my notes here. Hamilton, in that speech, made the very statement that I've quoted several times. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born. The other, the mass of the people. Because the people are so fickle, they seldom judge or determine right. Give, therefore, to the first class a distinct permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second, and as they cannot receive any advantage by a change, they therefore will ever maintain good government, unquote. Hamilton says straight up, you can't depend on the people. The people don't know enough. The people aren't qualified to govern themselves. What we have to have is decisions made by the rich and the well-born. Those people that are born into particular positions in society. Those people that are educated in order to lead. They need to make the decisions, Hamilton says. And he says a number of other things that are very negative about the people's ability to govern themselves. If you read Madison's notes, which are the most detailed notes that we have on the Constitutional Convention, none of this is in Madison. He says barely anything about what Hamilton said during that 6-hour speech. He does mention that he made the speech. He does mention that there was a lot of important information in it. He does mention the fact that when Hamilton stopped speaking after 6 hours, everybody in the room got up. Nobody said a word. Everybody filed out in silence. Madison said basically everybody was stunned by some of the things Hamilton had said, but he never tells us what those things are. But Yates tells us everything Hamilton said. Everything. Yates tells us stuff in his notes that you can't find in Madison. Let me give you a couple of examples. These are quotes from Yates, Yates's minutes. The first one from Governor Randolph of Virginia during the opening of the convention. Governor Randolph of Virginia candidly confessed that Americans were not intended for a federal government. He meant a strong, consolidated union in which the idea of states should be nearly annihilated. Governor Randolph, who later on does not oppose the Constitution, will not sign it, says that the convention is necessary because the people of this nation must live in a strong, consolidated union where the state governments are effectively annihilated. If the people of the United States knew that Randolph said that at the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution of the United States would not have been ratified. Yates goes on and makes mention of Madison. And this is what Madison says at the beginning of the convention. It is impossible that the Articles of Confederation can be amended. They are too tottering to be invigorated. Nothing but the present system or something like it can restore the peace and harmony of this country, unquote. Madison is the one that made the proposal to totally scrap the Articles of Confederation. We know that the convention did it. We didn't know that Madison is the one that proposed it. He didn't say that in his notes. But Yates says that. And then we get to Hamilton. Robert Yates says in his note, when he mentions Hamilton, he puts in parentheses, one of the great weasels of all time, unquote. And then he says this, to avoid the evils deducible from these observations, we must establish a general and national government completely sovereign and annihilate the state distinctions and all state operations, unquote. If the people of New York knew that Hamilton had said that in the convention, they never would have ratified the Constitution. The reality is New York only ratified by 3 votes anyway. If they knew what was in Yates's notes, it never would have been ratified. He mentions George Mason, who's there throughout the convention, but at the end refuses to sign the Constitution because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Mason says the following, let me ask, will the people entrust their dearest rights and liberties to the determination of one body of men, and those not chosen by them, and who are invested both with the sword and the purse? They never will. They never can. To a conclave transacting their business secret from the eyes of the public. Basically what he's saying is we got to have a Bill of Rights, because the people in their right mind would never trust their rights to a group of people that was meeting in secret. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, quote, mankind are apt to go from one extreme to another. And because we have found defects in the Confederation, must we therefore pull down the whole fabric, foundation, and all in order to erect a new building totally different from it without retaining its materials? And the implication is no, Ellsworth is saying. We don't have to throw out the Articles of Confederation, we just fix them. But Madison said, scrap them. Bedford of Georgia. Gentlemen, I do not trust you. If you possess the power, the abuse of it could not be checked. And what then would prevent your exercising it to our destruction? You gravely allege that there is no danger of combination, and triumphantly ask, how could combinations be affected? The larger states, you say, all differ in productions and commerce, and experience shows that instead of combinations, the larger states would be rivals against each other and would counteract the views of one another. This, I repeat, is language calculated only to amuse us. Yes, sir, the larger states will be rivals, but not against each other. They will be rivals against the rest of the states. Unquote. Gouverneur Morris. History proves, I admit, that the men of large property will uniformly endeavor to establish tyranny. How then shall we ward off this evil? Give them the second branch, and you secure their weight for the public good. They become responsible for their own conduct, and this lust of power will ever be checked by the Democratic branch, and thus form a stability in your government. That really worked out great, didn't it? And then finally, there's the statement of George Mason, in which Mason said, the idea of letting the people choose the president would be as unnatural as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man. Unquote. These are highlights from the notes taken at the Constitutional Convention by Robert Yates. But here's the issue. They were not published until 1838. We never saw Yates's notes until 37 years after he was dead. Yates led the opposition to the Constitution in New York. He was joined by his colleague, fellow delegate John Lansing. Turns out that Lansing was Yates's clerk. Lansing was much younger than Yates. He clerked for Yates. And long after Yates died, Lansing helped edit his notes for publication. And in 1838, the Yates family agreed to publish the notes because Yates was long dead, and the notes wouldn't do any harm now, and they would help the people better understand what happened in Philadelphia. And so the book that contained Yates's notes came out in 1838. In it were Yates's notes, plus the detailed analysis of the Constitution written by Luther Martin, an attorney from Maryland, called The Genuine Information. Luther Martin's criticism of the Constitution was published during ratification. The problem with Luther Martin was that his analysis was so damn good that most of the people couldn't even understand it. It was published in the newspaper, and the only people that could read and understand what Luther Martin said were Federalists. And what they did instead, they couldn't argue down Luther Martin's Genuine Information because his understanding of the Constitution was so solid. So what they did was criticize Luther Martin himself. They called him an alcoholic. They called him a raving lunatic. They said basically you can't understand what this guy's doing. He raves, he lies, he goes all over the place. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And basically what they did was take the influence of the genuine information as it was appearing in the Maryland newspapers and in other states as well. They took Luther Martin to the cleaners and so besmirched his reputation that nobody would take his criticism of the Constitution seriously. But they wouldn't have done that to Robert Yates. Yates was a prominent attorney in New York. Yates made the decision that because the Constitutional Convention, when it met, had voted to meet in secret in order to give the delegates the freedom to say what they really wanted to say, the delegates realized that the only way we can have a constant exchange is to make sure that everything that is said here stays here. Everything that happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Yates was a man of principle. He would not violate his oath to never release his notes because they were taken in secret. He wrote in the newspapers under the name Brutus and other articles under the name Sidney. He criticized the Constitution. He led the anti-federalist opposition in the New York Ratifying Convention and came within 3 votes of defeating the Constitution. But he didn't quite do it. Alexander Hamilton and Madison's Federalist Papers won the day in New York by 3 votes. If Yates's notes had been published, the Constitution of the United States would never have been ratified. If the people of Virginia had read what Governor Randolph and James Madison and George Mason had said in the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution of the United States would never have been ratified in Virginia. What a damn story. It's been there all along, and I didn't see it until now. Here is a man of principle that would not violate an oath he took, even though the result was the approval of a form of government that he was philosophically totally opposed to. He did everything he could do to defeat it, except do the one thing that would have defeated it, which is to violate his oath and make his notes published, make his notes known by publishing them. He didn't do it. His notes aren't edited and published until years later. In 1831, 7 years before the book comes out, Madison was talking about Robert Yates, and this is what he said. Robert Yates was a highly respectable man who was a zealous partisan and has committed gross errors in the desultory notes he took in Philadelphia. But he never published them. If he did, I don't believe we would have the Constitution of the United States. I think that's a fantastic story. I think it says a hell of a lot about Robert Yates. And I plan to say it. We're at the end of our day. We're at the end of our week. It's top of the hour. It's 3 p.m. here in the East. I want to thank you so much for tuning in to today's program here at the Virtual Center. We did get a little bit of the 18th century in the second half, didn't we? That's what I set out to do. I hope we could do that. I'll come back and visit some of this stuff when we get together, and again, the first of next week. I hope that you have a wonderful evening, a great rest of the week and weekend. This late summer weekend, enjoy it. The weather's supposed to be pretty good, I understand, most places anyway. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Be kind to each other. Enjoy each other. Love each other if you can. And thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center, and thank you for your support of Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On Radio Network. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you very, very much.